Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a horror and thriller wrap-up video. Before we get started, I do need to confess that I have a problem and I think I need an intervention, so stop me. Drop a comment down below and call me out on this, because a while back I said that I was going to stop reading young adult horror because it wasn't connecting with me, it wasn't working, and I put myself on a ban. And sure enough, as soon as I put myself on a ban from reading the genre, I go and I look at my wrap up for this video, and well, I read more young adult horror. But I want to say, for those of you that prefer adult fiction like myself, I do also have some adult recommendations for you, both in terms of true crime and a horror novel, so definitely stick around. But yeah, I went back to YA. It just happened. I'm so sorry. I have reasons. I have lots of excuses, and I'll get to those as we go along. But I did actually find some good young adult horror, so maybe it wasn't a bust altogether. And all that being said, let's get started. First, I want to talk about some adult horror so that I don't lose my whole audience, and I read The Croning by Laird Barron for my book club. This is a piece of cosmic horror that follows an archaeologist who is examining this cavern, and then strange things start to happen and the story goes from there. I'm going to keep the synopsis really vague, not because of spoilers, but honestly because I have no idea what I read. This is a book that was nominated and selected for my book club for the month of witches. It was the theme that was selected, and this book, while it technically deals with some black magic, wasn't very witchy, and I kind of suspected that going in. The first chapter I actually really liked. It was a retelling of Rumpelstiltskin, and I really did enjoy that, because if you actually read the original story, as with most fairy tales, they tend to be really dark, so I like that. But then it segued into the main story, as I described, about this archaeologist, and it just did not grab my attention. It didn't hold me, and I just struggled to follow it. I do struggle in general with cosmic horror. I just don't think it's my thing, and so unfortunately it wasn't a book I was really drawn to, and I only read it because of my book club. And I always do say book clubs are a great way to try books that I otherwise wouldn't pick up, so I don't criticize that at all. If you're interested in joining my Patreon book club, I always have a link down below, and while I didn't love this book, I know you or someone else might enjoy it more than I did. And next month we're going to read a favorite of mine's, a reread. It's Stranded by Bracken McLeod, so I definitely hope you jump in for January, because the discussions are really fun and it's just a great Discord group. We all hang out and share our lives and just talk about things offline. Then to segue into young adult horror, I read Hold Back the Tide by Miranda Salisbury. This is a book that follows a young girl who is living with her father, and right at the beginning of the story she tells us, the reader, that she knows that her father was a murderer, and specifically she knows that her father killed her mother, and she's afraid to go to the police, and so she keeps this a secret and just tries to keep him happy, tries to keep him fed, and just lives in fear of him going and of course murdering her or attacking her, and just lives in this constant state of fear. I want to let you know as the reader that this book is purposely shelved in the horror section, not the thriller section, which might surprise you given that synopsis. Other reviewers will give away why that is the case, and I feel like it's a spoiler to give away that reason, so I'm going to leave it a little bit vague. But I will say that this book actually worked pretty well for me, which I'm happy to say. The reason I went down this horror young adult rabbit hole this month was the fact that I was going to be a guest on the Books in the Freezer podcast, and I needed to read some young adult fiction for it, so I had a very good excuse. Specifically, I was trying to read 2021 releases and find something that I could recommend for the best of the year episode, and this was definitely one of the first contenders, and you'll have to listen to the episode to see what actually made the cut. But I like this one a lot. Again, I actually really like the horror aspect that was brought into the story. I just can't tell you because it would be a huge spoiler. This book reminded me of one of my favorite horror books that, again, I know a lot of you also loved, so if you liked that book that I cannot mention, you will also enjoy this one as well. Again, it's so hard to recommend a book without spoiling it. You know me, I always think that less is more, but if we share taste and you're open to young adult fiction, because it definitely is that, but it was pretty good. It avoided most of the love triangle tropes that I typically can't stand. You might want to check this one out for yourself. I did think it was quite entertaining. Next, for young adult horror, we have The Woods Are Watching by Stephanie Perkins, and this follows two young women who go off to camp in the woods. At the beginning of the story, they're a little bit apprehensive. One of them isn't much of a camper per se, and they are just going to connect and, continue their friendship, and the story follows them, and wouldn't you know, as it is a horror story, things start to go terribly wrong and the story goes from there. This is one I picked up somewhat reluctantly because I read the author's previous attempt at horror fiction, and that was There's Someone in Your House, and that was a huge disappointment. So for those of you that share my disappointment of that book, I will let you know that this one is leaps and bounds better. I really appreciate that this one was actually focused on the horror and at least had less of a love interest. In fact, because it is about two women and two friends specifically, while they talk about boyfriends and love interests, it's really not the center or the focus of the story at all, which is nice. Instead, again, it's focused on their friendship. And the story, for the most part, starts off a little bit slow. It's more, again, about establishing the characters. You get to find out their backstory, their history, and some past trauma that they have. And I think the author did a good attempt of trying to get us invested with the characters, and I think it worked for other readers. Myself, not so much. I just was never overly attached to the characters, which unfortunately made me not overly attached to the horror and the plot, because when things start to go terribly wrong, I wasn't really too worried whether or not anyone was going to get out and survive. So I will say that this book is so much better than her last one, but I personally still found it to be honestly quite boring. Perhaps if you're someone who really likes horror stories centered around camping and the woods and all of that, you might enjoy this one a little bit more because it's definitely a main point of the story, that survival aspect, but it just was a little bit, boring is probably the best word for me to describe it. And I will give it credit that the book is very short, because if it had been longer, I probably would have DNF'd it, but it was so short, I decided I might as well see it through, and it turned out to be just okay. This is why I typically don't read young adult horror fiction, because it just tends to be just okay. Moving right along. Then I went on to read Ace of Spades, which is technically more of a young adult thriller than a horror, and typically I never read those anymore. I tend to prefer my thrillers in the adult category, but this one, the setup honestly intrigued me and I just couldn't help myself. I had to check it out. While I was delving into the age category, I was like, well, I might as well go all the way. And so this story, if you don't know, is set at a prep school at a very wealthy place in the States, and we follow two students who are targeted by this entity known as Aces, which is basically a stand-in for Gossip Girl, for those of you that are familiar with the TV show. I was a huge fan of the original TV show that came out. It came out right when I was a teenager, not to age myself, and I was pretty addicted to it at the time. So when I found out there was a new YA thriller that was all based around it, I had to see it for myself. The story is told over two perspectives, and specifically it's told from the perspectives of the students that are being targeted by this online presence, and they are taking pictures, they are calling out their secrets and embarrassing them online, and really ruining their student lives as they are just about to finish up school and hopefully apply for universities. The interesting thing about this book is that it's told from the perspective of two Black students, and so on top of everything going on, there keeps being this lingering question of whether or not this is all racially motivated or if there is some kind of link there, but you really don't know, and I'm not going to give away whether or not that is the case or not, but it made for some fantastic social commentary, some interesting discussions, and I really enjoyed just the incorporation of those conversations. And so it really took Gossip Girl, which is a very, very white show, and brought some much needed diversity into it. So I'll be honest, if you do not care about Gossip Girl, if that doesn't sound good to you, this might be one to skip. But if you also fell down the rabbit hole of that addictive, gossipy TV show and are looking to kind of fill that void or relive those days, I would recommend this one. It was so addictive. I listened to the audiobook. I flew through it in just a couple days and had so much fun. I really do recommend it if that's up your alley. I loved it. I don't even want to admit how much I like this book. It's a little bit off-brand, but yeah, I had fun reading it. Then switching back to horror, but again staying in the young adult category, I then went on to read The Dark Descent of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Kiersten White. This is a piece of historical horror that follows a woman who was adopted by the family of Frankenstein, and so Victor Frankenstein became her pseudo-brother, or a similar cousin-like relationship began between them as children. And you also find out that they then brought in another girl who Elizabeth forms a friendship with. And the story is told over the passage of time, so you get to see them as children, but also as they start to get older. And you get to follow them specifically in terms of the relationship between Elizabeth and Victor. And if you are someone who loves character-driven stories, this is one you really want to check out, because the relationship between these two characters is absolutely fascinating. It is so toxic and smothering and complex and so interesting. I have to say I was really surprised how much I love this book, because I don't typically enjoy historical fiction. I don't typically enjoy gothic fiction. I've never read Frankenstein. I've never been overly interested in the retellings. But even if that is all the case for you, you still want to read this book, because it is so well done that even if you don't think you want to read this book, you do. It is fantastic. I will say that while it is young adult, it again avoided all the young adult tropes. There is a little bit of a love interest woven into the story, but it's not done in a young adult way. And I gotta say that this book could easily have been written and just classified as adult if they just tweaked a few things in the story or just simply branded it differently. But yeah, I love this one. The character work was amazing. Elizabeth is such a complex character, and Kiersten White just writes such a feminist character who is not perfect. She is not flawless by any means, but instead very morally gray. And you put her aside Victor, who is potentially the psychopath character. He is just very morally ambiguous himself, and the story just gets darker and darker, and the layers, and I do have to give huge content warnings for gruesome and disturbing storytelling. It goes to places, and I loved it. So easily one of the best surprises I've had reading in a long time. And I gotta say, it is definitely a new favorite. At this point, I've locked in my favorite backlist horror books for the year. I filmed that video, I'm sorry. But if I had not, this book would probably be making a place on that, just to give you an idea of how much I like it. So if you are at all open to trying young adult horror, or again, even if you normally avoid it, I would really encourage you all to make an exception for this one. I thought it was so fantastic, so well plotted. And again, I don't like slow-paced gothic fiction, but I love this one, and I really think a lot of you will too. If you haven't read it yet, highly recommend. And finally, let's switch gears once more and talk about some true crime. And I read A Killer by Design by Burgess. And this is a true crime account of the first female profiler in the FBI when they first started their criminal profiling unit. And for those of you that love Mindhunter, this might be an interesting one to read alongside. This story gives a bit of the female perspective, and so some of the prejudice that she encountered going through her position, but it actually barely touched on that, and either it wasn't a big part of her experience or just they simply chose not to make it a big part of the story. I expected there to be more, and I kind of wanted to hear more about that. Instead, it really just gives her account of how it all started. And I will say that if you have read the book or even just simply watched the TV show like I have, this story doesn't actually add much more to things that you probably already know. It talks about the same serial killers, gives their backstories and all of that. And I didn't learn as much as I wanted to within this book, but I'll say that it's very short, it's very concise, it's well written, it was interesting. I did read the entire book on audio in a day, so certainly there's no huge criticisms of it. I just don't think if you're someone perhaps who has read tons and tons on this topic, it just might not be anything new. So I kind of wanted more from this book, but there was nothing wrong with the book itself, if that makes sense. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear down below of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I would also love you to recommend me your favorite young adult horror books, specifically those that you feel transcend the age category and are perhaps a little bit more targeted at adults. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror. Most of the time it is adult, as well as thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. You can still help me out by giving this video a thumbs up, sharing it around online, and if you hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.